Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss cancel culture with Dan Kovalik.
It's not about, fighting for particular reforms to combat racism. It's about how I, as an individual, can struggle to become somehow less racist. There's these 12 steps you can go through every day to do that. It's all about an individual thing. It's this individual thing, like a Christian between him or herself and God. It's not about joining to create something to attack the 1% who have gained billions during the pandemic, while most of America has suffered. And very few people were out speaking against this, right? You have people living in tents in major cities. And, we're worried about how, again, to purify ourselves on an individual basis.
The cancel culture, a witch hunt by self-appointed moral arbiters of speech, has become the boutique activism of a liberal class that lacks the courage and the organizational skills to challenge the actual centers of power, the military-industrial complex, lethal, militarized police violence, the prison-industrial complex, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the intelligence agencies that make us the most spied upon, watched, photographed, and monitored population in human history, the fossil fuel industry, and a political and economic system captured by oligarchic and corporate power. It is much easier to turn from these overwhelming battles, to take down hapless figures who make verbal gaffes, those who fail to speak in the approved language or embrace the approved attitudes of the liberal elites. These purity tests have reached absurd and self-defeating levels. The irony, of course, is that the cancel culture was pioneered by the red baiting of the capitalist class and their shock troops in agencies such as the FBI to break radical movements and labor unions. Tens of thousands of people, in the name of anti-communism, were canceled out of the culture. The well-financed Israel lobby shutting down critics of the Israeli apartheid state and those of us who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement as anti-Semites is a classic example of how cancel culture is used to destroy free speech. Joining me to discuss the cancel culture is Dan Kovalik, the author of Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Culture. So Dan, let's begin, because the cancel culture has been picked up by the right wing. That's not where you come from. It's not where I come from. And I think that you would argue that, in many cases they have a point. Let's explain what the cancel culture is first, and then perhaps you can talk a little bit about its roots, because traditionally it's been the left and the liberal class through certainly the Red Scares, the red baiting, that have been the victims, but not anymore.
Yes, correct. First of all, thanks for having me on, Chris. Really appreciate it. So I think the type of cancel culture, I think there's a few types that I focus on, are cases where someone, a well-intentioned person, says something that others deem offensive. It may be offensive, or it may, again, be construed as offensive. People then mob that person on social media, perhaps. And in extreme cases, they call for that person to lose their job, to lose their position, to be deplatformed. And we see this over and over again. The most recent case I saw was from, I think this week, the CUNY law dean has resigned because she said at a board meeting that people were treating her as if she were a slaveholder, which to me is a fairly innocuous statement, but that's the level we're at, that any misstatement can lead to this type of cancellation.
So talk about its origins. How did it arise within the culture?
Yes, well, I agree with you that we can trace it back certainly as far as McCarthyism, maybe farther than that. I mean, we have an interesting culture and society where we have a very brisk First Amendment and free speech rights. But always along with that, side by side with that, we've had periods where people are persecuted for certain things, whether for being a witch, for example, or an alleged witch, or for being a communist. But the current cancel culture, I believe, emanates from the postmodernist movement in the 60s and 70s, from the New Left, which I think has its roots in postmodernism. And this all comes, again, from the academy, that I think largely at one point had a large base in Marxism. But then through the McCarthy witch hunts, the Marxists tended to be purged, and you had this new movement which essentially abandoned class and class struggle for more, let's say, identity politics, and also, frankly, abandoned reality for some notion that there may be no objective reality, and that what is more important is how people feel about reality. And of course, once social media, the internet is created, social media is created, you have this ability to attack people in a very quick, easy way, in which you have the attacker has virtually no accountability, because they can do it anonymously, right, if they wish, and in which they can attack people, again, not necessarily for the things they do, but the things they say and the things they think, because, again, we live in this world where reality is not as important as the perceived world and one's thoughts. And so I think things really accelerated with social media. But again, I think we have to go back to the postmodernist movement, and again, really the attack on communism and Marxism in the, well, really since the Russian Revolution, but certainly since the McCarthy period of the 1950s.
You write in your book, in the spirit of cancel culture, many on the left of the political spectrum are excited about the new round of censorship being imposed by corporate giants such as Facebook and Twitter, which have now banned Donald Trump, and Google and Apple, which have kicked Parler off of their app platforms, making it nearly impossible to download that app. All of a sudden, these corporate behemoths, the ones who have truly been engaged in the looting of America, are now the liberals' saviors, or so they may think. Can you talk about that alliance?
Yeah, well, it's a bizarre alliance. But as you say, there is now this notion amongst many liberals and self-proclaimed leftists that somehow, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and the Twitters of the world are on our side, and that they will and should engage in censorship of the right and of people who propound theories that we don't like, with the belief that that won't come back on us, on the left, when in fact, every study I've seen shows that the left tends to be more censored by these groups than the right. But there is this belief that somehow these companies are on our side. And of course, we see this too with how big companies like Amazon, and again, Facebook and Trader Joe's and Target and others have supported even, left-wing protests, the BLM protest of the summer, given millions of dollars to foundations linked to somehow to those protests. And so there is this bizarre kind of alliance between, again, what calls itself the left and the corporate world.
Right. The fact is those digital platforms very quietly have already begun censoring the left. They took down WikiLeaks. They destroyed its funding mechanism. They used electronic interference to block people from going into its events. And then they've used algorithms for several years. I've been a victim of that, to marginalize critics of capitalism on the left. And so it's not even hypothetical. This process has already begun. You make a very important point. Again, it's at the beginning of your book. You say the left's obsessive concentration on purely symbolic struggle, for example, on removing statues even of abolitionists and of trying to cancel works of art and books that, though flawed in some ways, have tremendous historic and other value. These symbolic acts, while having some importance, take energy and effort away from the fight for things such as health care and income support that will actually help people, and that a greater proportion of people in this country would be willing to get behind. Such acts tend quite unnecessarily to alienate many people who might otherwise join the struggle for progressive reform. I think you're making the argument that the whole cancel culture is only widening the social and political divide.
Yes, and I think it's meant to. And what it is doing, again, is, I think, alienating people who could be the allies of the left, who frankly could be won over by the left. You know, poll after poll shows, for example, that huge majorities of the American public, like 67%, the last I saw, support Medicare for all. The majority of the public supports police reform, supports criminal justice reform. On every poll, Americans tend to be pretty good on these issues. But instead of focusing on those issues, which are winnable if, you know, we have a broad enough base, you know, agitating for those things, we tend to, in fact, look down upon many of the people who would otherwise support those things. We look down on middle America, on people in the rural areas, even people, for example, who voted for Trump, even though there was nearly 75 million of those people, right? And instead of trying to win them over, we simply vilify them, right? And we cancel a whole group of people. They're the deplorables, as Hillary Clinton said famously, and that term has been adopted by many other liberals who have embraced it. Meanwhile, what you saw this summer, and as I point out in the book, incredible things. You had people in Hazard, Kentucky, protesting for Black lives. You had people in Nebraska doing that. You had people in the most conventional places. You know, you had the deplorables out protesting for Black lives. So what does that tell you? Those people are not all racist and backward and fascist, like a lot of people say. They're reachable, but because of the focus of cancel culture, we turn those people away and we turn them off. And that is what happened, by the way. By the end of the summer, while the BLM movement had gained support after the murder of George Floyd, by the end of the summer, less people supported the BLM movement than before the George Floyd murders, because they were turned off by a lot of this stuff. And then we have to acknowledge it. We have to, if we want to move forward, we have to acknowledge our mistakes as a movement.
When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about cancel culture with author Dan Kovalik. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about cancel culture with the author Dan Kovalik. So let's talk about speech. You write, speech that offends but does not interfere with another's right of participation should not be banned or otherwise suppressed. Rather, such speech, as I took from, you're talking about Professor Powell class you had, should be met with speech, with argument and dialogue as a means to advance both free speech and hopefully equality as well. But those people who propagate cancel culture have a different notion of the boundaries for speech. So can you speak about that issue?
Yes. So now, while the left and liberals tended to embrace the idea I was saying, that we need a free marketplace of ideas and would defend free speech to the wall, now many on the left and liberals believe that certain speech needs to be suppressed. And again, it could be in many times merely offensive speech that really doesn't harm anyone, or just perceived to be offensive speech. Again, maybe no one's actually offended by it, but it's perceived to be offensive to others. And so, again, instead of engaging with that speech and hearing someone and then trying to counter what that person said with facts and with figures, the goal is simply to silence those people. And by the way, a lot of times that's because there aren't good arguments against what certain people said. And there's an example of this again from this summer. There was a gentleman, I'm forgetting his name, but on Twitter who tweeted out this study. I think it was a Harvard study that showed that nonviolent protests are more effective at winning people over than violent protests. And this was actually a study conducted by an African American professor. And this guy was mobbed on Twitter, and they called for him to be fired. I think he was, in fact, because he produced a report that people found inconvenient, and they couldn't disagree with it on the merits, but they somehow found it, again, impolite in the context of the day where people were engaged to some extent in violent protest. And so they just certainly simply called for him to be silenced. And that is
well, Lee Fang endured this at The Intercept when he quoted someone who talked about black-on-black violence. It was a quote. That's his job. And he was attacked by people within his own organization.
And he was an African American.
These kinds of attacks,
yeah. The guy he
that these kinds of attacks, you write, resulting, you write, in racists simply doubling down on their bigotry. Why?
Because I think that, first of all, people feel offended when they see someone canceled for what they deem to be a minor infraction. I think, too, when you over broadly characterize people as racist when they're not, or they at least don't want to be and don't believe themselves to be, they may respond to that with a certain fatalism and say, well, I guess there's nothing I can do not to be racist. So, these things tend to backfire. Again, because you're not trying to engage people. You're simply trying to vilify them and marginalize them. And so how are those people going to react? Are they going to try to embrace your views? No, they're probably going to reject them and retreat into their own, subculture, which may be, right wing or whatever.
You write, BLM protests, at least the ones I witnessed, were indeed more religious in nature than they were political. They seemed more about white protesters going to somewhere to somehow purify themselves than about achieving any particular political ends, and that's quite possibly why they didn't really achieve any such ends. I think that point of moral purity is key.
Yes. Yeah, I think that what you see, again, in a country that is very religious in many ways, even if not in traditional ways, you see people engaging in these movements in a religious way, where, again, the way they speak is scripted as a religious group might, in which they're asked to, of course, repeat chants as you would in church, literally kneel as they would in church. And also to, like the old monks who used to flagellate themselves, kind of engage in this self-trial by fire, where they confess to being whatever, racist or whatever they are, and seeking some sort of redemption. But of course, as I note in the book, this particular religion offers no redemption. You will always be somehow flawed. There is no heaven awaiting you, which again seems to me like, well, why would you join that religion? I mean, that's the only reason you might,
You write in the book, the goal of canceling, it seems to me, is not to educate or to advance the cause of social justice, but to punish and ostracize. It is not a means to an end, it is the end.
Yeah, well, you saw this again. You saw these strange scenes over the summer where people would go and shout at people while they're dining and tell them to lift their arms up and protest or chant something. Again, is that calculated to win those people over? I mean, if it is, it's a total miscalculation. You're never going to do that. You will turn those people off. So again, the goal is not necessarily to win people over. It's to show your own moral superiority to them and to yourself and to your friends. And again, by outing other people, by casting others out and shunning other people. This is, again, a classic religious thing. It's like the Amish and their shunning. I mean, it's the same thing.
You argue that these people don't want, you write, real social change. They want at best to settle scores, to advance their own careers and their own reputations. Is this a movement that at its core is about narcissism?
Well, I think that individualism, which again this country's been infected with from its origins, and the natural outgrowth of that narcissism are very much a part of this. It is about, and again, the whole struggle against racism has become this individualistic struggle. It's not about, fighting for particular reforms to combat racism. It's about how I, as an individual, can struggle to become somehow less racist. There's these like 12 steps you can go through every day to do that. It's all about an individual thing. It's this individual thing, like a Christian between him or herself and God. It's not about joining to create something to attack the 1% who have gained billions during the pandemic, while most of America has suffered. And very few people were out speaking against this, right? You have people living in tents in major cities. And, we're worried about how, again, to purify ourselves on an individual basis.
I want to ask, you write about the authoritarian right, and you use the term authoritarian left. Is this ideology the foundation for an authoritarian left?
Well, I think so. And some people, like Matt Taibbi, he wrote a piece comparing it to the Maoist Cultural Revolution. I think there's apt comparisons there, because the idea is that you can be with me, you can be a comrade, but if you don't think the way I think you should 100% on 100% of the issues, or you don't speak in the jargon I think you should, even though that jargon changes by the month, right? Then I am going to cast you out. We're only going to draw in the ranks of people who agree and speak 100% of what we approve of. That is an authoritarian way of acting. And we're going to get you fired, by the way, if you don't toe the line. I mean, I think that has to be viewed as authoritarian. And I note in the book, of course, that psychological studies say in terms of the psychological makeup of the authoritarian right and authoritarian left, there's not much of a difference. They're authoritarians. They just have a different political outlook.
Well, that's why Hitler would only recruit from the Communist Party. You quote Professor Adolph Reed, who himself is black, that the view that anti-racism in the 21st century may end up being used for the same purposes as racism was in the 20th century, to divide the working class in ways that undermine its ability to fight corporate and state power. Is that what's happening?
I think so. I think you're seeing that. Again, what you're seeing is that you have this real urban and rural divide, first of all, where most of these movements we're talking about are based in the cities, which tend to look down upon those in the rural areas in Appalachia, who tend to look down on the working class, who they view to be basically white, by the way. You don't hear about the black working class. You hear about the white working class. And so what has happened is the class that we thought might be the mover of history, and it might be the vehicle towards changing our very exploitative economic system, is being rejected, and people within that class are being rejected by this cancel culture movement. And I think much to the delight of the ruling class. I think they're laughing at all this. I mean, you have working class people fighting each other in the streets. It's the best thing could ever happen to the 1%, and they're making out like bandits.
Great. That was author Dan Kovalik on his new book, Cancel This Book: The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture.